it can impact performance by as much as 6.5 to 10%. That's a sizable number. I think there's a lot of stuff that people spend their time on, and a lot of those things are often marginal gains. When we're talking about heat and being affected by it, I don't think this is an area of marginal gain.
If it's 50 degrees outside and you throw on a long sleeve shirt and a light jacket, that's not going to cut it.
Even if you're not training for a hot race, you're going to be going into a cold race, and so you don't think it is as necessary. Heat training has performance benefits in general terms. You will be more fit.
One study found that 2 days of reacclimation doing that same protocol will compensate for 12 days off. So if you did 2-week block early in the cycle, and then 2 days of every 2 weeks following, you're going to re-ping that adaptation. But the interesting thing is every time you reacclimate, you may actually get a little bit more benefit.
But you love talking with me.
I do. I'm not sure everybody wants to listen for 4 hours, though.
That's fair. All right. Do I look good?
Mm-hmm.
Great. You look great. So I'm going to love getting nerdy with you on this episode, like I love getting nerdy all the time. And for us, this story starts with an abysmal from my perspective, running of the Leadville Marathon, not the Leadville 100. It's a dream one day. We'll get there. But the Leadville Marathon. And it was such an excruciating event for me. And for those who don't know, the Leadville Marathon is in the summer, and it is a marathon, as the name would suggest, but up to the highest point just outside of Leadville, comes up to about 13,500 feet and comes back down to 10,000. So you're at elevation, and it can be quite hot. Tons of up and down. And so it's particularly challenging for a sea level boy like myself. I crossed the finish line being absolutely destroyed. And I'm pretty sure I just cried in your arms. And from being absolutely in pain from this thing that I signed up for and thought would be fun. From that, we looked up, okay, if we were going to do this again, how would we do it and how would we train for it? And we went into overdrive with researching a bunch of different ways to do that. And that led us down a path of altitude training, but ultimately led us down a further path into heat training. And since us being from New York and it's extremely humid and hot, we then thought we should probably understand what's going on here as well in the heat space. So today, we're going to be talking about all things heat training, what we've learned over time, what does the current science say, and Molly's going to talk a bit about the research we've done, because one thing we want people to understand, particularly as we are getting this podcast launched, is people understanding that this is something that we put a lot of heart, effort, and time and research into, and we're not just sort of pontificating without having done any review professionally as coaches to understand what it is that we're saying. But we'll be talking about heat training, why running in the heat is so challenging, why we should be thinking about heat training, and then the different protocols that we can employ to achieve it. Is that a good start?
Yeah, I think so.
So, Molly, would you kindly start us off on understanding the sources that we used for this episode in particular, but anything you'd like to share about our process for trying to find and pick the best things to review when we're trying to understand what the current science says?
I would love to. So kind of high level, when I first started digging into this, and actually the first time we looked into it when you ran Leadville, I want to guess was...
I'm still crying.
2019?
I think that's
like
right.
That.
Yes.
So interestingly, even since I did the initial research and, we're now 5-6 years on from that, some of the understanding, I think, of mechanisms at least has changed a little bit, which was interesting to me. But big picture, I was specifically looking for studies that looked at elite athletes or well-trained athletes. And I think this will probably become a recurring theme when we dig into science on some of these episodes. But if you look at studies, and there are plenty on moderately trained or untrained individuals, you often get really stellar results that are, kind of hard to parse from, is this just a result of training or being on some sort of
General
actual
adaptation.
plan?
Yeah.
General adaptations. Obviously, the less well trained you are, the more room you have to improve and the more room there is for any stimulus to work. So I was really looking for things that were in well trained athletes or elite athletes that obviously have kind of maxed out um, a lot of the low hanging fruit, at least. And that's not from a quality of athlete perspective. It really is just from a, if it works on people that are that well trained, it will probably work on anyone.
Yeah, I don't think there's something inherent to being an elite athlete that would make you more, especially because we know a lot of this is, some of this is genetic. But I think that your genetics around your ability to respond to heat training is independent, I think, of things like your slow twitch, fast twitch muscle fiber composition.
Right. And I think, there certainly will be things that we look at in the future that are, inherently, when you tend to be more elite, you are highly trainable. So, there are areas where you do see that, but as far as I'm aware, heat training is not one of them.
Right. So elite athletes almost serve as like a control, right? And so you know that if you're getting a response that is coming from the training that they're doing and not necessarily because they're just getting general benefits from the protocol generally.
Right. So the three high level studies that I started with was a 2016 study called From the Lab to Real World: Heat Acclimation Considerations for Elite Athletes. The second was Passive Heating, Reviewing Practical Heat Acclimation Strategies for Endurance Athletes. And the third was Heat Induced Hypervolemia, which is the expansion of blood plasma, as we'll talk about. Does the mode of acclimation matter, and what are the implications for performance at Tokyo 2020? So I think for everybody that remembers those Olympics, the heat was a major topic, both going into the Olympics and during. And we saw a lot of different strategies kind of playing out, especially in the endurance space in that Olympics.
I think that was the first time I saw those like head
The
ice
cooling
pack
headbands.
cooling
Yeah.
things, which I think
I think
you've never
those have
seen
been kind of
since.
debunked. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we've seen them since. In large part because I'm not sure they were determined to have done that thing. It might have made somebody feel better because we know that's where
Yeah.
heat receptors are, but I'm not
Yeah.
sure it actually had an impact on your ability to be cooler in any real sense.
Yeah. And then along the way, I'm sure we'll include our own observational and anecdotal experience, but all of this is kind of underpinned by the science that's informed it. And as we get into each of the protocols, I also have some specific studies that we might look at.
And all of these will link to the extent possible.
Yeah, most of the ones that I chose, I tried to get ones that were full text publicly available.
And we were discussing this beforehand, but I think we like some of these because they are reviews and therefore talk about a range of other studies and why some of them, particularly if they're saying the same thing, that might be useful. If they have differing or divergent views, does that mean that more research is needed? Is there a reason why those divergent outcomes occurred? Whether in line or not in line with what we might have thought, we then often dig into those as appropriate.
So you have also read these review level studies, and I know kind of done your own deep dive, but it's kind of as we get started, why don't you walk us through generally what we should be thinking about in terms of heat training approaches?
So we know heat impacts performance. We know that anecdotally, and we hear that from other runners. I see on the subreddit for Run NYC, wow, it was a hot one today. And lots of people saying, yes, I also had a tough time. So we know that heat impacts us. And I think one of the things that studies can tell us is not only affirming what it is that we're feeling, but also by how much is it impacting us. One of the studies referenced a number that it can impact performance by as much as 6.5 to 10%. That's a sizable number. And when we think about why we should be thinking about heat training, I think there's a lot of stuff that people spend their time on. And a lot of those things are often marginal gains. And we tell athletes, Molly, you and I tell athletes to focus on things like, nutrition and sleep and consistency in training. When we're talking about heat and being affected by it, I don't think this is an area of marginal gain. And I think there are a lot of things that we can do, which obviously this episode is going to talk about. So, why do we really care? So, number one, of course, if you're going to be racing in the heat, that's going to be one major reason why you want to heat train, right? We want to ensure that we are able to handle the weather on race day. We talk about that in our episode about about evaluating a training plan and things that we want to consider that would inform our training and how we train. It would probably be on everybody's list of why would I want to heat train. But I think second and potentially more importantly is that it's going to enable us to train in the heat in advance of that race. So often, if it's a middle of summer or if it's an end of summer race, we're going to be training in the heat. And so being able to acclimate ourselves during training and even leading up to training means that we can train for a longer period of time or for a harder amount. And we can get more closely to the type of training that we would like to do. Third is, even if you're not training for a hot race, you're going to be going into a cold race, or maybe you're doing a fall race, and so you don't think it is as necessary, or maybe you're in a cold environment and you're going to be racing in a cold environment. Heat training has performance benefits in general terms. You will be more fit. And so even if it is not something where you need to train in the heat or race in the heat, there are probably still some benefits that you can glean from doing some heat adaptations. And finally, we often hear that heat training is a, quote, poor man's altitude training. We'll talk about this at the end of the episode, but there are definitely crossover impacts from heat training. And indeed, you might be even a greater responder to heat training than altitude training.
So to your point earlier, I just kind of wanted to highlight the 6 to 10% performance benefit when we're talking about marginal gains. Like, we all get super excited about 4% from shoes to the point that it's controversial. And
that's 4% efficiency, which I think often
which isn't 4% of performance.
Right. And this is a measure of performance.
Yeah. So this is potentially, if you know you're running a hot race, this is a lot of time you're potentially leaving on the table or leaving to chance.
Right.
How many athletes have we worked with or been friends with that, trained really hard for a race and then at the end of the day said like, oh, it was hot. You can prepare. And that's, it's not a guarantee, but,
right.
It'll make you feel more confident, and it absolutely can impact your fitness.
So you may not be able to get all of that 6.5 to 10% back, but we can certainly get a lot closer to where you want or need your baseline fitness to be in order to achieve the outcome or goal you're looking for.
And I mean, I do think it's also important to remember that the weather is the same for everyone. So if you can be a little bit better prepared than this person racing next to you, then, good on you.
For sure. So we know that heat training is incredibly important. Why is running in the heat challenging, Molly? Before we get into actual protocols, what's actually happening in your body? Like the actual processes of why it is particularly difficult when it's hot out.
So the first thing to understand is about 75 to 80% of our energy production during exercise is actually just going to heat production. So in the same way that like a car engine puts out heat as a byproduct of the power that it's putting out, our bodies do the same thing. And we are, in fact, not particularly efficient.
I think we're actually less efficient than a car in that regard.
Yeah, it's actually pretty sad.
You'd think that we would be a bit better after a long period of evolution. It always perplexes me why we are so inefficient, especially when overheating is clearly not a good thing.
And humans are one of the few species that is able to deal with cooling ourselves over a long period, which is actually part of the reason that we can run long distances, at least according to Born to Run. But really, the thing to understand here is that you both have the exterior environment that you're having to deal with, and then you have this massive amount of heat that's just coming really from your muscles trying to put out power. So your body needs to regulate that temperature. I think everyone's aware that we need to maintain core temperature within a few degrees or things really start to go sideways. So that's going to be your body's top priority when you're running. And it's the kind of thing that if things start to get too hot, your body will absolutely shut you down before you really get into dangerous territory, hopefully. So we have a couple of strategies that the body does to do this, and most of them have to do with fluid balance. So the first thing that happens is some of your blood volume gets shunted to capillaries close to the surface of your skin. And that has kind of two purposes. One, it can just radiate some heat off, hopefully. And the bigger the difference between the outside air temperature and your body temperature, the better that will work. And obviously, once you start getting closer to 98 degrees or above, then that strategy ceases to work. The takeaway there being blood is getting diverted that otherwise would be carrying oxygen to your muscles. Instead, it's going to your skin. The other thing that happens is you start sweating. And so water is coming out of your pores. It's going to evaporate. Evaporation is a cooling process. So that should physically cool you. But as we know, the more humid it gets, the less well that strategy works. If there's a bit of a breeze, that will help. And obviously, as runners, we're moving through the air. So that gives you a little bit of breeze regardless. But again, the higher the humidity goes, the less well that strategy is going to help you. And that's kind of the reason why hot and humid is kind of the worst condition for your body to try to deal with regulating itself.
Right, because the ambient environment is preventing the cooling method from
kind
happening.
of both of your major strategies aren't going to work as well.
Just to emphasize a point that you made, not only is then blood being diverted away from muscles and, as you said, less oxygen, but the water is coming from your blood.
Right.
So your blood is then thickening and less oxygenated blood is reaching your muscles.
Yeah, so your effective blood volume is essentially dropping. And this is actually measurable if you were to do a VO2 max test in normal temperate conditions versus hot weather. You would actually see a drop in your VO2 max, and that is simply because less oxygen is going to be able to get to your muscles. The other thing that happens that I think, probably most runners have experienced, even if they didn't quite know what was causing it, is, if you think of a long run or a long race that you did in the heat, your heart rate starts to really creep towards the end. And some of the reason for that tends to be you're losing some of your blood volume through sweat because some of that, that's kind of where the water is coming from for sweating. So as your blood volume drops, your heart has to pump faster to compensate for that. And so there really is, other than hydrating, there is no way to counteract that.
Mm.
And so
I
that's
think a
something.
higher heart rate, I think, not only actually means you're working harder, I think that we are then attuned to that increasing our rate of perceived exertion, which can start triggering sort of like alarm bells for, oh my God, I need
Right.
to, slow down. So I think you can see this sort of cascading effect of not only are you actually working harder and your exertion is bigger, but it's then getting you more quickly to a higher rate of perceived exertion, even though you're not going anywhere near as fast.
Right. And then I think the two knock-on effects that you kind of need to be aware of is because you're getting less oxygen to working muscles, your body is less able to produce energy oxidatively, which means it's then going to revert to glycogen stores, which means fueling with sugar is going to become more critical. And also, you're just more likely to bonk earlier if you're not refueling appropriately. So both of those things I think are adjustments that need to be made. in terms of both, remembering that how critical hydration is just to be able to maintain your heart rate and, not even before we even talk about regulating temperature, just to be able to maintain a fluid balance for general functioning. And then just ensuring that maybe you're switching your fueling strategy a little bit, and not being so reliant on fat stores for fueling. So I think the last consideration is that fast twitch muscle fiber measurably produces more heat per contraction than slow twitch. I would say anecdotally, both for myself and for athletes I've coached, I would say the athletes that I would consider a bit more fast twitch in terms of their physiology also seem to be the ones that have a harder time in the heat and have their performance more affected. I haven't seen any studies that looked specifically at that, but I do think if you're a person that sort of identifies maybe as a little bit more of like a natural sprinter, I think it's worth thinking about. And people that tend to be a little more distance adapted naturally, I think also tend to have it be less affected by the heat, which doesn't mean that you don't need to train for it or fuel and hydrate accordingly, but I think it seems to impact performance a little less. So Matt, you're about to run Vermont 100 as we record this in a few days, and you have been heat training.
I
So I'm
have.
curious what your experience has been. We can go a little bit into the protocols, and talk about that, I think, as we go through them. But in general, I would be curious if you feel like, after a few weeks of this, if you feel a difference.
I would like to think that I do. um, and I certainly feel like I am more prepared going into Vermont this weekend and literally starting in 3 days from now. I did this sauna protocol and running in the heat. So I've done effectively two of the protocols that we're going to be talking about, which is running in the heat and ensuring that I'm getting sufficient exposure safely in the heat itself, but then also a sauna protocol. And I've done this now both for this training cycle and for last year's training cycle. And it looks like this year's weather is about going to be the same. I do think that there is a difference. I definitely notice, especially when, and we'll talk about this in the sauna protocol, when you are in the sauna for 7 to 10 days, I do notice that for a given heat, because sometimes the sauna fluctuates a little bit in heat at the YMCA, but at a given heat, it does seem to me that I am starting to sweat more quickly, which is what it is that we want to see, right? Part of heat training is to tell your body, hey, okay, you need to rev up the engines to start sweating so that you can give yourself the best possible chance of cooling. And so I do think that that's definitely happening. And so I weigh myself before and after most of my sauna sessions. And obviously, I know how much time I've been in. And so I know that generally speaking, towards the end of a sauna protocol, I am sweating more for a given amount of time. And so I do think that I'm seeing those types of results. Now, whether that translates into performance is something that we'll also talk about. I'd like to think that it did. I fared, I think, pretty well in the heat last year. Um, in Boston 2 years ago, it was a particularly hot day. We also employed some heat training in advance. So even though I was training in colder weather, I still had access to a sauna, and I knew that there was the potential for Boston to be hot. And so I had done a sauna protocol session in advance of Boston 2 years ago. It was a hot day. Most people did not have a good day, and I had a really good, in fact, I had a PR. So yes, are those like small samples, and is there causation? Maybe. I think that's, I'm certainly going to give myself the best chance. And so my experience has definitely been a positive one. So let's talk about it. Let's get into the different protocols. Okay, the good news is that it doesn't have to always be that difficult, and it doesn't always have to be that uncomfortable. And there are ways in which we can train our body to better adapt to and run in the heat. Generally speaking, there are three primary heat acclimatization strategies, and we're going to talk about those in detail here. So first is training in a hot environment, right? If you live in a hot environment, this is obviously going to be an easier one for you to do. We'll talk about the pros and cons of this. The second is adding clothes to amplify the natural environment or to mimic a hot environment. And like a lot of people will remember or recall movies where people are wearing trash bags and a ton of layers in order to make them hotter during their exercise. We'll talk about the efficacy of that or potential lack thereof, and the studies that have looked at adding layers. And then the third is sauna or hot tub after workouts or as a standalone mechanism. I've used two of these three. I really hate adding layers to my run. I'm already uncomfortable. Hopefully, when Molly goes through the science of adding layers, I will be justified in not wasting my time with it. So we have these three methods. What does heat training and the associated protocols actually do in high level terms?
The major adaptation that all of these really are getting at is primarily increasing blood volume. And that mostly comes from plasma, which is the liquid part of the blood. And the reason that helps, as we talked about in the earlier section about why running in the heat is hard, is the more blood you have, the more ability you have to send some to your skin and to lose some for sweating without it becoming a critical situation. So you're both better able to cool yourself, and then your muscles are better able to still get oxygen delivered. Your heart doesn't have to beat as fast to deliver that blood. So all of this sort of the biggest adaptations seem to simply come from blood volume more than anything else. Interestingly, as a kind of aside, when I was looking at these studies, in this space 5 or 6 years ago, the thinking was that the increased blood volume eventually led to increased hemoglobin, which kind of makes sense. You're kind of thinning your blood essentially if you're just adding the liquid portion. So it does eventually, after like 6 to 8 weeks, stimulate red blood cells. So you're getting a little bit of natural EPO from this. However, recent studies have shown that it seems to be the actual volume that is the bigger gain than the increase in red blood cells. So I think that's both an interesting development in the science, and also it's kind of good news because the blood volume increase happens much quicker than it takes your body to signal and then create new red blood cells.
Right.
So you don't necessarily need to plan for 6 to 8 weeks until you feel a benefit.
And would you say, does that mean that the benefits from heat training are more for the heat? Because I thought that some of the EPO production was relevant for altitude as well.
So it seems to be, and we'll get to that later, but there have been a few studies that either did sort of a short term 3 to 4 week portion of the study, took measurements, and then let some or all of the athletes continue for another, total of 6 to 8 weeks, and then did another measurement. So in some of those, they did find that the altitude adaptations took longer. So I think when we get to talking about altitude, that's something to consider. If that's the benefit you're going for, you may in fact need to be putting in, more like 2 months of heat training to really reap the benefits that are going to help you at altitude, because while in some ways the solution is the same, the mechanism for what makes it difficult is different. So we'll talk about kind of why heat is kind of a usable substitute, but it's, not 100% what you need.
Got it. I would like everybody to know, if you're watching on YouTube or if you're not watching on YouTube, that depending on the day, the fastest
The periodic
athlete
nose.
and the fastest athlete in Molly's apartment is Liza, Molly's cat. So she's making an appearance right now. She's inspecting the microphone. I just want to make sure, is she giving us the go ahead to continue recording?
I think we're cleared. Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So in addition to increasing blood volume, compensating for what it is that we're losing for cooling. We also know that heat training protocols aid in thermoregulation, right? So can you go into the specific things that are actually happening to our body's ability to thermoregulate?
Yeah. So the increased blood volume is going to facilitate all of those adaptations. So things that you would notice as you become better heat acclimated is that you'll start sweating earlier, and that's partially availability of fluids, but also that your body becomes more quickly triggered to respond to heat. So that's helpful in the sense that you don't have to heat up quite as much to start all of those cooling processes, which in theory then means that you don't ever heat up quite as much.
While that's
The
great
second,
for performance, I will say that it is not as great when you're just walking to the subway
yeah, and
on a hot day.
unfortunately, the sweating earlier and the higher sweat rate that you get also just happen in life. So these are not left on the track or
Yeah.
the road,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Your body doesn't, if you start walking outside and you are heat acclimated, you're just going to start sweating earlier. And yeah, if that's not what you want in that moment, that's a little bit of a trade-off you have to take. Okay,
Yep.
so what's next?
So the higher sweat rate could kind of initially seem like a bad thing in the sense that you're both losing fluids more quickly and potentially electrolytes. One of the ways that your body does get better at compensating is it starts to conserve electrolytes better. So your sweat actually becomes a bit more dilute. This obviously, as we'll go into a bit later, is affected by things like diet or, even humidity is going to change the amount that you're sweating and potentially concentrations. But overall, your body gets better at holding on to sodium and other electrolytes that it needs. And then the last one is you get a lower resting core temperature. And the nice thing is that also applies in life. So, yes, you get the higher sweat rate, but hopefully you're also a little bit cooler all around.
So when I'm walking to the subway, my shirt's going to be soaked, but I'm going to be cooler.
Maybe you're only going to be like 95.6. So,
Right. Got it. Cool. All right. So let's start talking about each protocol. So the way that listeners, we have organized the next part of this discussion is that we're going to take you through each protocol, right? And to recap, that's going to be training in a hot environment, adding clothes to amplify your natural environment, and then sauna and hot tub protocols. We're going to go through what the protocol is, key considerations, pros and cons of those protocols, what we've learned, and what the science says about the efficacy for each of them. And then after all of this, we're going to talk about maintenance, heat adaptations, and also about safety. So I just want to emphasize before we get into all of this that doing these protocols safely is of utmost importance. So we'd be remiss to say that not all of these will work for everybody. And I think if you do them recklessly, you put yourself at risk of things like, heat stroke. If you sit in a sauna and are not thinking about the fact that you are losing a ton of water and you don't go into that hydrated, or you don't leave it hydrating, you are putting yourself at risk. And so we just want to emphasize that we are talking about the efficacy and pros and cons. And we will talk about safety again later, but it stands to be emphasized that we don't want anybody to putting themselves at risk in trying to do these protocols, especially when we're talking about, again, running in the heat and making sure that you are adequately hydrated. Okay. So with that said, help us understand what is the protocol for training in a hot environment?
So this is everybody's favorite. It's hot outside and you need to train. So you may as well do it in such a way that you actually get a heat adaptation from it. It takes 3 to 4 days to get the initial response. That's about how long it will take to see an increase in blood volume. And it kind of starts to flatten out after 10 to 14 days. So you've really kind of hit diminishing returns at that point. But at about 10 to 14, most people are going to hit their maximal plasma volume expansion that they're going to get to. And in order to achieve that, you need about 60 minutes per session. And it does need to be pretty hot. So we're talking about 86 to 104 degrees was the range that was cited in most of the studies. And you need that daily.
I suspect that is consecutive
That
days.
is consecutive when they're saying 10 to 14 days. Most of the
Right.
protocols were daily. There was a study that looked at over 3 weeks, I think, a total of
Right.
14 exposures. So, not quite every other day. So you can kind of spread it out, but it's going to take then obviously more time. The 14
Right.
days is 14 exposures or 13
Right.
exposures, somewhere in that ballpark. But I think the temperature is also worth noting, 86 to 104. So I think most runners like to start complaining about the temperature when it gets above 60 degrees. So it's not really going to help you until it's much warmer than that. If possible, these protocols should be done during the hottest part of the day. If it's already 86 degrees in the morning, great. But I think even in a lot of places in the summer in the US, it's going to take a hotter part of the day to really get to an effective dose.
Well, and
There were a
middle of
couple,
the day is likely going to be slightly drier than
right.
the higher humidity in the morning. And so if you've got, mid 70s or low 80s and it's more humid, but it's a little bit hotter in the afternoon, again, emphasis on safety, but it might be that the hottest part of the day is when the protocol will actually work.
And there was some evidence that showed that hotter and drier environments are more effective than little cooler and more humid. I'm not sure that we 100% know why, but the thinking is that because one of the adaptations that you're looking for is sweat rate, when it is less effective to cool yourself through sweating, your body is probably not going to keep pursuing that adaptation as much as it would when it's drier and the sweat is helping you. So I think that's another reason why midday is probably a better time than morning or even evening potentially. And then there were a couple studies that we looked at that did look at longer exposures, as I mentioned. So there was one that looked at 5 to 6 weeks and did find that there was an increased hemoglobin, which is red blood cell mass. That was hematological adaptations to prolonged heat acclimation in endurance trained males. It was a study from 2019. And we'll link to that in the show notes. But again, kind of similar protocol. All of these were looking at about an hour a day in the 86 plus range for temperature. And then the other kind of variation on this that I wanted to touch on is you can still kind of mimic the hot environment if you're training somewhere, if it's winter or you're training somewhere that is cooler than where your race is. I remember back in the days when I was reading everybody's race reports and blogs to figure out that was how you learned about ultra running. Hearing people talk about training for Badwater and just packing their garage with space heaters and putting an exercise bike in there. So, athletic facilities do tend to have, some of the better ones will have a heat chamber that pro athletes will use for this kind of thing, but you can kind of rig up your own with space heaters and a treadmill or a bike. So again, safety first, but it's an option. And you would just do the same protocol for those.
Yeah. Again, safety first. We'll say it 100 times. I don't want anybody thinking, Backline is advocating.
Also, don't burn down your garage.
Yeah, don't burn down your garage or house. Okay, so what are some of the key considerations for this protocol?
I think this is the protocol that probably has the biggest sets of caveats with it. The main one, and this is something that we leave workout notes about all the time, is when it's really hot out, and that is this 86 to 104 degree range, the heat is the stimulus in terms of the stress of the workout. And at trying to do a quality session, speed work or threshold or something else that's adding more stress on top of that starts to become counterproductive. You're really risking overtraining. It's tough to recover. It's going to be tough just to refuel that because it's going to be very depleting. So for most of these protocols, they really recommended only doing easy running. So you're talking about 10 days to 2 weeks continuously of only doing base miles, essentially. The second consideration is you're going to need to start the workout hydrated, drink more while you're running since it is hot, and also keep in mind that if it's working, your sweat rate is increasing.
Right. If you're sweating
So
more
at the
and you
end
are
of,
sweating faster, then you're
right,
going to need more. You're going to need to hydrate more and sooner.
right. So at the end of the protocol, maybe counterintuitively, you're going to have to pay a little bit more attention to hydration than you did before. There were a few studies that mentioned that improved sensitivity to thirst came with heat adaptation. And it
Yeah, I saw
seemed
that too.
like people that were heat adapted were better able to regulate their hydration. So maybe that helps, but it is
I'm
something just
wondering.
to,
I'm wondering if that's from because you are more thirsty. You're just drinking more often. I mean, I whether it's the multi days that we've done or Vermont or some of the other hot races. I know that when I'm hot, I'm also just drinking more, and so I'm curious. I'm curious if that's causative or if that's just when you're doing all this training in the heat and you are sweating more that you just get a little bit more thirsty, and so it becomes then a little bit more habitual.
yeah, certainly it should be self reinforcing.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah,
So, as we said, this kind of needs to be thought of. If you're doing this in the middle of a training cycle, you should think of this as its own kind of little mesocycle, the same way you might for a 2 or 3 week block of speed. Just consider it, this is my heat training block. Don't get in your head about the fact that you're not doing any other workouts. This does have a big effect on performance, and you should treat it accordingly and give it the time that it needs in your schedule. And the last thing is this protocol in particular, because it's environmental, you can do this through any endurance modality. So it doesn't have to be running. It will be just as effective if you do it cycling or rowing or on an elliptical, depending on your setup. So if this is something where running outside is not possible and you need to do it, again, setting up your garage or something, doing it on a bike is going to be just fine. These aren't adaptations that are working muscle specific, they're systemic. So as long as you're getting the endurance stimulus, it should be equally effective.
yeah. I just want to make sure we're drawing a distinction of like if you're in a hot gym, that's different than being in a heat box.
Yeah, that's
Like
not hot enough.
right, that's not hot enough. And so just being in the general section and being like, wow, I really sweat in the gym because it's just hot and humid in here and there's a lot of people breathing heavy, that's not the kind of like heat that's necessary. Okay, so if I'm both from my experience and from what you've said, I think the pros of this protocol would be that you're doing this heat training in your training. So it's not adding time to your workout, it's not adding time to your schedule. You're just making sure that you're running in an environment and during times of the day where you can achieve an adaptation. Particularly if you're going to be racing, I think another major benefit of this is that it's mimicking race conditions. You can practice with fueling and hydrating for the event during your training.
And I do believe from the studies in general, it showed that hot environment is the one that gave you the best performance benefits in the
Yeah.
heat.
Yeah, I
So
did see
if
that
you're
as
really
well.
talking about a race that will be hot,
Yeah.
this is really your best bet if it's available to you.
I think this is potentially one of the riskiest of the three protocols, and that in general, we're talking about you being in the open heat, and anything where you're in the open heat would apply, whether that's sunburn or being far away from your ability to address, things like heat stroke, right? And so that's different than some of the other protocols, particularly in sauna, where we'll get to, where that's in a somewhat controlled environment and you're probably near a water fountain, et cetera. You'll need to add time in the training plan to forego other stimulus. So if heat is now your training adaptation, then maybe you're not doing the hard workouts that you think you might need to do. And I think when you're considering whether this is a protocol that you want to do, and you're doing a 400, you're doing an 800-meter race, your ability to do those workouts and making sure that those are in your training might be more important than setting aside 2 weeks to doing heat adaptation. It's also harder to control, right? If the temperature drops, and if you're in the middle of, say, a 1 to 2 week period where you're trying to employ this, well, if all of a sudden it starts raining in the middle of that for 3, 4 days, and you're not going to be able to get that effect, you can't control the weather. And so I think, here, if this is the only thing that you are relying on, then you are not in control of Mother Nature. Okay, can you talk a little bit more about the efficacy sort of elements of this particular protocol?
So, what we can see measurably is an increase in plasma volume, which is the main thing we're after, increased sweat rate. You get a lower core temperature, as we mentioned. It does seem effective to lower both resting and your active heart rate. So, both of those are going to be helpful for your race. And then again, it does, because it's so specific, particularly if you can mimic the environment you're going to be racing in, it is the most effective strategy for performance outcomes. That's one thing across these studies and different protocols. There are some where we kind of see the biomarkers that we want to see. We can see increased plasma volume or earlier sweat onset, but there's actually no measurable performance improvement. So that's the thing that we really care about. And at least with training in the heat for a hot race, this is your best bet to actually get the performance bump as well.
Yeah. Okay, so to wrap up this section, I think what we're saying is likely the most efficacious, probably the lowest cost, because this is just part of your natural training. And if you're in a hot environment, then and you have access to the sun, then great. But it requires being in an environment and in a time of year where it's reliably hot. So if you are in a cold environment, or you are just in a colder environment, it doesn't get to this level of heat, then this might not be an option for you. And that's where these other two protocols come in. So let's get to protocol number 2. So this is adding clothes to augment your natural environment to make it hotter. So if you can get into the protocol, the exposure, and how that might differ from training in a hot environment.
The exposure for adding clothes or adding a heat suit is pretty much the same. We're looking at the same 10 to 14 days and about 60 minutes per session. And you need to add enough clothing that you're going to get to that 86 to 104 degree sweet spot. This is one where I do think if what you're working with is a normal gym, you probably could throw on enough layers to get you there if it's a normal, 72, 75 degree gym. You could probably get there, do your treadmill workout or your bike or whatever without too much trouble. One thing that I want to highlight on this one is it's kind of the most loosey-goosey because we're just trying to add layers. There's not really a good way to measure your skin temperature or your core temperature and really figure out if you're getting to the right level or not. So this one, while it's pretty accessible for most athletes, is also going to be the hardest, I think, to really do in a methodical way, let's
Mm.
say. And I think another consideration is
Yeah, I think it's
even
just a
just the
bad experiment, right? It's like a bad. There's so many factors I think that go into this, and so the execution risk on this is high.
yes, the layers that you choose will affect it. Most of us have some kind of wicking clothing that we prefer to run in, and in this case, you really don't want it to wick because if it's wicking away from you, it's cooling you, and that's not what we're going for in this case. It's also going to affect the way that you hydrate and fuel, and it's probably not going to exactly match the conditions of your race. So while you might be practicing hydrating and fueling, it still might be something that you find you need to adjust because it's different on race day. So that's another caution for this one. I think it's worth going through. I looked at 3 different studies on this because the data is kind of all over the place, and I think it's worth quickly talking about them. So the first one was effective 2 weeks of endurance training wearing additional clothing in temperate outdoor environment on performance and physiology and the heat. So 2018 paper. It tested triathletes. I think this was in Australia. And they divided them into 2 groups. One group was wearing what they described as typical spandex shorts and a sleeveless jersey. And the second group was the heat training group, and they were given a long sleeve jersey, full length tights, gloves, and a thin jacket. The outdoor temperatures when they did this were 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So it really was not hot outside. That's more clothing than I would be wearing normally in 50 degrees, but it's not a crazy amount of clothing. And they gave the specific product for the jacket that they used. I looked it up, and it's described as a breathable wicking jacket. So I don't think that was doing a great job to trap heat. But what they found was they did 2 weeks of usual training, standard protocol, 60 minutes per session. Sadly, they did not take core temperatures or sweat rates during the protocol. They only did it at the beginning and the end during the time trials. So it's really hard to gauge what the athletes that were wearing the extra clothing were experiencing. But they got no stimulus from this based on the results. So this is a
Solid.
cautionary tale. If it's 50 degrees outside and you throw on a long sleeve shirt and a light jacket, that's not going to cut it. You're probably just going to be annoyed and slightly too warm and not really get any benefit from it.
It's going to restrict your ability to train because you've got all these extra layers. You're not getting hot enough. You're going to be really uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough so as to even yield a benefit. That's what I'm hearing. Cool.
Correct. So now we're going to go into the ones, yes, we're going to go into the ones that worked that sound like an absolute hellscape. So number 2 is physiological and perceptual responses to exercising.
Before we get into that, I recall, I think you were training once for your first 50K, and it was in the heat, but it was in the end of May. And I believe in your April training, you were adding on layers. I think in retrospect,
I was.
That probably didn't do a whole lot for you.
It probably what I was thinking about this too, as we talked about these studies, and it probably didn't do a whole lot. I will say I was in incredible shape for that race. I felt really prepared. I was not worried about the weather going in. So, for whatever the placebo effect was worth, it was probably worth it. Right. And I did it. The only reason I was willing to do this was it was an early summer race. So essentially I just kept wearing winter clothes. And it was kind of an easy roll off from winter because I just wasn't losing layers, and it didn't feel particularly, it wasn't as though it was August and I was putting on 3 shirts. So it was a little bit easier psychologically, I think, just because I was kind of continuing to run in what I had run in through the winter. In retrospect, I don't think it was enough to really give me an adaptation.
Yeah, and I raise it because I think that what you did as somebody just trying to do everything that they could is not uncommon. And I think what we're saying here is that it's probably not helping. And maybe there's some placebo. Maybe you're just feeling better and a little bit more fit, but your performance on the day likely would have been the same regardless.
Well, and we're going to talk about 2 studies where it did help, but what they had to do is slightly horrifying. So the second study, they weren't testing adaptation over time, but they were testing 4 different protocols with the same group of cyclists. So each cyclist in the study did all 4 setups, and they were spaced out such that they would lose the adaptation, presumably between each one. So you're not, from the first to the 4th, you're not looking at a cumulative gain. So the first trial was temperate environment, 71 degrees, wearing regular athletic clothes. Second protocol was wearing a sauna suit, top only, regular shorts, and that was done in temperate conditions, so the same 71 degrees. The reason they decided to do just the top and not the full sauna suit was that most of your heat production and where you would lose heat is in your torso and your arms. That's also where most of your sweat production occurs. So they could really still capture the bulk of the heat from the sauna suit while leaving a little more comfortable for cycling without the bottom. So the third protocol, again, same group of athletes are doing this whole thing, was wearing regular clothes. So we're back to the original clothes from the temperate trial, but now they're doing it in a chamber that's 113 degrees.
Whoa. How did they get them to 113 degrees?
It was a controlled chamber.
Oh, it's in a chamber. Okay.
Yeah, so these were all cyclists on a stationary
Got
bike.
it. Steamy.
Yes. The fourth one, we bring back the sauna suit top, and it's still 113 degrees.
Oh, it got worse. Okay.
It got worse. It got a lot worse. I don't know how they recruited these people, honestly.
What would it take for you? How much money?
I mean, I
5,000?
value the science, but I
would probably do
I
it for
don't
pretty
think.
low. I gotta be honest.
Really?
If you gave me, like $100 gift card, I'd probably sign up for this. I would
A
probably
sauna
sign
suit
up
in
for,
113 degrees.
for sure. Yeah, because you know that there's gonna be a like, there's gonna be some footnote that's gonna be like, that I'm gonna be
You're
able to
just
point
going to
to it
be
and be
called
like,
a well-trained athlete.
yeah, and I'm gonna be like, that's me. They're referring to individual number 5 who experienced either no gains or outsized gains. I'm hoping that I can just be an outlier, so they can they can write a footnote about me.
So that
Yeah,
your data gets thrown out actually because you're
oh, I didn't think
an
about
outlier.
that.
Yeah.
I don't want that to be the case. But yeah, $100 gift card, I'd do it.
Anybody looking for a study subject?
I've literally reached out to people to do it for free. So I'm down. I shouldn't say that. At least I want at least
we'll get to
$100
the
gift
next
card.
trial and we'll see how much
Okay.
you would need for that
Okay,
one.
ask me on that one.
But in any case, what they found from the 4 trials was that the ambient heat and both of the sauna suit options all produced enough stimulus in sweat rate and core temperature to elicit the
Sorry,
adaptation.
both of the sauna suit ones did?
Yes, so sauna suit either in 71 degrees or 113 degrees worked.
Huh. I didn't think that because I did not read this one. I did not think that the sauna suit, as you were describing this, in temperate conditions would have done anything. You're
Work.
saying it did.
It did work, yes. The greatest stimulus was from like heat suit plus the 113 degrees.
Right. I guess what's curious is, would the sauna suit one in temperate conditions have yielded, like, was that just an increase in biomarkers or an increase in actual adaptations that might improve in performance?
So this one did not look at performance. It looked at, are we achieving the amount of stimulus that we know to be effective from other protocols?
So a proxy.
So yeah, this one's like a step removed, but I think it's an interesting setup nonetheless to kind of compare in the same athlete, how do they respond to these different conditions.
Right. I agree that this is way better than the first study.
Yes. And then the third one, which was from 2020, also used cyclists because they're everybody's favorite study subject. That one just divided the cyclists into groups performing one of 3 10-day protocols. So this is on the shorter end of when we would expect to see adaptation. Their protocol was either 50 minutes of cycling in 95-degree temperatures, 50 minutes of cycling wearing thermal clothing. And I dug into exactly what they meant by that. And that is a wool layer on both the upper and lower body, a wool hat, a down jacket, and a nylon jacket and pants with pore evaporative capacity over all of that.
Hold on a second. I got a question for you. Do you
Yes.
think then the people wearing puffy jackets are onto something here? Because I mean, I can't
Oh, the ones
run
that we see
using a.
running in puffy jackets?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely can never. I don't think I can ever run in a puffy jacket. I just get way too
Yeah,
hot.
I have never in my life.
But
It
full
has
like
never
full
been cold
down puffy
enough.
jackets. Yeah, full down puffy
Yeah, I
jackets. I
have
occasionally
run
see.
in Northern Iceland in February and did not feel moved to wear a puffy jacket.
Got it. Okay. So they're wearing wool all
So they're
over and a
wearing
down.
wool all over, a hat, a down
Mhm.
jacket, and then on top of the jacket, another nylon rain jacket and nylon pants that
Wow.
were specifically designed to have poor evaporative
Okay,
capacity.
so you got to look like the Michelin Man.
Yes. So how much of a gift card do you need to do this one?
I might.
50,
Do I?
50
Hold on.
minutes
Oh,
of
50.
cycling
Whoa,
in
50
this.
minutes.
Yes.
Okay, question. Do I
And it's
get to?
95 degrees. Yeah. No, this was
Okay.
the wool setup was not 95 degrees.
Oh, okay. All right. Well,
It
okay.
was
Do I
it was
get?
a normal temperature room.
All right. Question. Is my gift card
Mhm.
in addition to? Do I get to
The
keep
the
all of?
clothes.
Oh, do I get to keep the clothes? Because
I
that's
don't
like
think
so.
anyone wants those clothes back.
Okay. So you don't think that the the down jacket is like goose, like high
I don't maybe
quality.
it's nice. I don't know.
Okay.
But
All
yes,
right.
I would assume you can also keep the clothes.
Okay, so let's assume I can keep the clothes, and there are a couple that's worth at least several $100s.
Yeah.
I'm still gonna go with the $100 gift card.
Really? 50 minutes?
Science, science. Don't you want? Don't
Okay.
you, that's my legacy.
Mhm.
That's what I want. You said
All
you still
right.
haven't told me your number. Five hundred
Over
dollars
500
over
certainly.
500. Okay,
Yeah.
certainly.
I
Okay,
think we're
all
we're
right,
nearing 1,000 for this one.
all right.
Okay. And then the third group, which we haven't gotten to yet, got all of the thermal clothing. And then they got to get into hot water for 25 minutes afterward.
Oh, so this is crossing into our next section.
Yes.
Okay.
So, interestingly, they all produced a similar adaptation.
Hmm.
The hot water did not add anything.
That's very curious.
Yeah. So, an interesting one from the standpoint of comparing 95 degrees ambient temperature to lots of clothes or lots of clothes plus hot water.
Got it. All right. So
So, there are ways to make the clothes work. They sound pretty unpleasant
right. Okay. So
unless
yeah,
there's a $100 gift card involved, apparently.
that's all I need.
Yep.
Um, okay, so summing this section up, on the pros side, it's probably somewhat easy to implement. You can get sauna suits online for less than $100, and they will work to varying degrees of temperature and fashion. And some
You
of them
can
look better than
puzzle
others.
everyone around you who
Yes, you
is
can definitely.
questioning your sanity
Yeah,
when you run
yeah.
by.
Well, it's kind of like in National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation with the couple next door, and they go out and they're running their little suits. It kind of reminds me of like the old track suits when I looked them up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are
Um,
definitely like 1980s technology.
yeah. I don't think we've moved on since then.
No.
They basically, if you want to look like 1980s Michelin Man,
If you want, yeah, you needed non-breathable plastic, which the 80s
yes,
were good at.
yeah, they were. So likely easy to implement, relatively low cost. It likely doesn't add time to training, although similar to the other protocol that we talked about for training in the heat, you're probably going to have to adjust your training during the exposure period because I don't know about you, but doing intervals, wearing all of that stuff is not
Absolutely not.
possible. So that means that like at least in running in the hot environment, you have to adjust it. You can still probably get in some workouts and do some strides maybe. I don't think you're really going to be moving. I would actually be
Yeah.
personally worried about depending on how many layers I had. I mean, I already don't like wearing tights in the winter for races because
Yeah.
I feel like it can really restrict my ability to move quickly. So I think that then gets to the cons of this protocol, which is that it's probably impacting how you train to such an extent that maybe you're getting some of these physiological adaptations. I just query whether you're losing what is otherwise an ability to train. Like if I didn't do intensity for 2 weeks, because I was trying to do this protocol. That's tough to say. I like that would be a very interesting additional further area of study, which is you had another control group that like they just had them do a normal unaffected training cycle, right? And then
Yeah,
compared
and this
like
is one I think if it were me and I were coaching somebody to do this, I think the way I would probably want to set it up is maybe you do stretch it out to 3 weeks. And I think running in this amount of clothing is kind of untenable also.
yeah.
So I might be inclined to set it up so that your easy days are on a bike with a lot of layers. And then we just do it every other day, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing the heat training, and you probably can't then do all of the intensity that you would because we don't want every day to have a stress on it. But I think you could still sneak some speed in or at
Yeah.
least some kind of maintenance dose. But I would probably stretch this out to 3 weeks at that point to
Sure.
make that work.
So the final thing I'll say, and then we'll get into sauna and hot bath protocols, which are my favorite, is that we're recording this episode a little bit after Western States, and David Roche was publicly talking about the challenges that he had in his race. And if you haven't listened to that episode, it's a really good episode. But he did mention, and this is an N of one, but he did mention that he made extensive use of sauna suit in his recent training protocol in preparing for Western States. And he questioned whether that impacted his body's ability to sweat. So there might be a nugget there of sometimes these studies or even in practice they might yield some sort of physiological thing that can be measured. How that then impacts a real world environment is something that really needs to be considered. And so, um, it'll be curious if he talks about it in more detail on subsequent episodes of his own podcast. But I just thought it was an interesting set of element that I wanted to raise, given that
Yeah, I think
he's
specifically he was saying that he found when he was training with the sauna suit that he had to do way more salt
yeah.
in his hydration than he did that perhaps would have needed in the race otherwise, that he thought that he probably overdid the salt early. So that is something I haven't really seen it addressed in any of the studies, but I think it's certainly plausible that something like a
Mm,
sauna suit that is really making this little microclimate around you,
yeah.
and you're going to be at a lot higher humidity in there. So I think it's worth considering that whatever hydration and electrolyte plan that you may need while you're training may have nothing to do with what you actually need in a race environment.
Yeah. All right. So two down, last one to go, sauna and hot bath protocols. My
Yes.
favorite because I think that these are the things that you can control for the most and mitigate the risk of execution. But let's talk about the sauna protocol. This is a protocol that I have implemented multiple times over the last 2 years, both for this training cycle for Vermont, last training cycle for the Vermont 100, as well as for Boston
Boston.
2 years ago. Um, so walk us through what that protocol looks like.
Sure. Sauna and hot bath, we've kind of grouped together. They're pretty similar in terms of both protocol and stimulus.
And hot bath, just to level set, we're talking about hot bath, and you'll talk about the temperature, but like up to your neck, right? And we're not
Correct.
talking
That
about
that is the
yeah,
preferred.
and we're not talking about hot showers. So like nobody should think
Correct.
we're talking about like just turn up the heat on your shower. Your shower may not even
Right.
get to the level of you might be you're probably going to be scalding and burning yourself before you get to a point where it's actually useful. So
Right. And you're
anyway,
not submerged. So,
and you're not submerged. Yeah.
but both of these fall under the passive protocol because there's no workout involved. You are just resting in a sauna or a hot bath. They are, however, most effective if they are done immediately after a workout, and we'll get into why that is. But the standard protocol for saunas is similarly 6 to 12 days for about 30 minutes per exposure, and that sauna temperature, it needs to be somewhere between 180 and 194. Came up in a couple studies, which is a pretty standard range as far as I'm aware for most saunas. I will say that infrared saunas don't get that hot typically, so that's something to consider
Some
if
gyms
that's what's
also have,
available.
yeah, and some gyms also have a limit, like a safety limit of around
Yeah,
180. And so they usually get to like maybe 185 just because like the sauna machine will be on and then it will like obviously continue emanating heat, but it kind of it's regulating itself to stay at the closer to the 180 mark. And so getting to 190 or 200 is likely in outside of sort of like big chain gyms. I still think 180 is a fine temperature, notwithstanding the temperature cited in some of these, because I think, as you said, like the range includes 180.
right. So the reason that you ideally do this directly after a workout is that you want to get into the sauna about within 5 minutes. So the idea is that you just aren't allowing your core temperature to drop. So your temperature is elevated in the workout, and now you're just extending that, but passively. There's a lot of benefits to this as a method because you're not affecting your training directly. This is being done essentially as a recovery modality afterwards, and you're still getting a benefit from it, which is the reason that we like it so much. But 30 minutes can be challenging for some people. I've seen some studies that allowed the participants to kind of treat it as an interval. So you could do 3 by 10 minutes with a minute out, go back in, 2 by 15. I have seen some studies that, were closer to 20 minutes rather than 30, but somewhere in the 20 to 30 range was where most of them were aiming. Okay, Matt. So since you're the one that is currently in a sauna protocol, why don't you walk us through considerations that you've made as you've done it and then pros and cons?
Yeah. So at the YMCA here in New York, the Dodge Y in Brooklyn on Atlantic Street, they have both a dry sauna and a wet sauna. I have tried doing the wet sauna, and I think the there's not much data on the steam room sort of side of things, and so I think when we're talking about saunas, we're really more talking about dry saunas. You're never going to see a wet sauna up at 190 degrees. I think the wet saunas are usually closer because you're talking about steam, which is a greater conductor of heat, in the body. You're talking about, I think those are up to 110 ish, somewhere around there. But in any event, we're talking about dry saunas for the purposes of this discussion. I have really enjoyed it. I think that there are a number of pros to this. One is, yes, it does come with a cost, but it also means that I am not otherwise impacting my training, and so that means that you can still continue to do your training as you are able to do outside. Second, it's taking and adding a bit of extra time, and I know there's a discussion here about, well, should I be spending my time doing this sauna protocol or should I be spending a lot more time running, right? What would be better, like doing 30 minutes or 20 minutes of a sauna or spending a lot more time running? For me, I think just in terms of bodily stress, one of the other benefits to me of a sauna is that I can relax and it is passive. And so I'm still getting something out of it, particularly if I'm going there after a run. But it does also require daily access to a sauna. And so if you're somebody who doesn't have that access, totally understand that this is obviously not going to be a protocol that is easy for you to do. It also adds time, and you may not have the time in your schedule to do it. I'm sort of fortunate in that I'm able to add that in my schedule, and it's something that I enjoy doing otherwise. I know some people don't actually enjoy doing the sauna. I think, Molly, you're actually somebody who, like, you understand the sort of science behind it, but it's not something that you sort of like enjoy or love doing, sitting in a
Yeah, it's
sauna.
something I would not do absent the benefit.
Right. And for me, I would actually genuinely do it regardless of the benefit. I mean, I do it to the same sort of quantum of times that I'm doing it when I'm doing it in the middle of a training cycle. But it's certainly something that for me, like having 10, 15 minutes in the sauna would definitely be useful. So I think that's, at least for me, how I've implemented it. And I think where I see some of the pros and cons of its use. In terms of efficacy, a lot of these studies talk about the exact same thing that we've talked about before, right? So increased plasma volume, increasing sweat rate. I have definitely experienced those over time. I definitely feel that anecdotally, but I can see that measurably because, as I said before, I am weighing myself before and after most of my sauna sessions to understand, like, is that for a given period of time, is the amount that I am losing increasing, so I can see that I'm actually sweating to a greater extent. Obviously, you also need to then be in a location where that sauna is being regularly, there can be some variability. I know that at mine at the Dodge Y, there can be days where I go in there and it's on the cooler side. I can be days where I go in there and it's on the hotter side, and that can affect how much time I sort of sit in there. And so that's certainly something that can also impact efficacy of this protocol if the sauna itself is not sort of at that temperature reliably. So, all that being said, while I love saunas, the Y does not have, and I would not find personally comfortable, hot water immersion. So, Molly, what are the differences, if at all, in the protocol implementation for hot water immersion?
It's pretty similar, maybe a little bit longer. I saw studies that went up to 21 days and as short as 6 for the total exposure. And similarly, 30 to 40 minutes following exercise is most efficacious. And most of them were looking at water at 104 degrees. So it's a pretty standard, if you had a hot tub, this would be a pretty easy one to do and pretty pleasant, I think. But an immersion does really need to be up to the neck to get good benefit from it. So doing it in a normal residential bathtub is probably going to be difficult.
And also, I think to that point, most people, even if they have a hot tub, are probably not up to their neck. They're, chest or whatever and have a beer in hand. So just to be clear, like when we're talking about hot water immersion here, like there's a little bit of work involved in that, like you got to be up to your neck. And I would just to again emphasize safety first. There are other considerations that should be made to the length of time that you are submerged. I find, and I think this is true, that sitting in a hot tub can dehydrate you pretty quickly. So you should have a water bottle to hand.
Yeah. And
I've
it's much
if I
harder
stayed,
to tell that I
yeah,
mean, you're not really getting sweat visibly. So I
yeah,
think it's easy to lose track also.
yeah.
The upside of hot water immersion that is unique to it, though, is that there is actually decent data that warm water soaking after a workout can speed muscle recovery. So you're getting a little bit of a 2-for-1 with this one. And the cons to this, obviously, you need access to a hot tub, and it is like the sauna, going to add time to your workout sessions. And I actually did just today, because Wednesday is the day that I get the dump of new studies for the week. There was just a study for hot water immersion, and I was kind of excited this morning and was hoping
Mm,
I would have time to get it in here. But it was looking at riding a stationary bike in a hot tub, essentially,
whoa,
while immersed in hot water. Similar
water
protocol.
biking.
From what I recall, I think it was 30 minutes, might have been 60. I, to be
Hmm.
very honest, did not make it too far through this study, but if you would like to put a stationary bike in your hot tub, I guess that's an option. It did confer similar heat training benefits, but and actually increased sweat rate, which I was a little bit surprised on because I would have thought that was probably I would have guessed you would get less of that when you're actually in water, since sweating is not going to help you a ton. But they did mention that you get
Hmm.
increased sweat
I mean
rates.
that kind of jives with like being pretty quickly dehydrated. I think this one I'm probably gonna need a $300 gift card because I don't know how to
Really,
swim. That's not true. I do know how to swim,
you
but I
do
don't like. I don't know. Getting pruny and all that
a
stuff.
hot tub, but you don't have to do laps.
I know, but laps are. I just even the thought. It's like when you get close to like, you know, that like alcoholic drink that like gives you the shakes and the nightmares. I think that's kind of how, like a little bit
Got
sometimes
it.
how hot tub does it for me. Like I
Okay.
can't, So yeah, I would need I think a little bit higher of a gift card. to do this one. It
Interesting.
sounds like you might do this one for free.
Yeah, hot tub's nice.
Yeah.
I would definitely do it as more of the interval structure. I don't think I could sit in a hot tub up to my
Yeah.
neck for 30 to 40 minutes at a go. But if I get to pop out every now and then, I'm fine.
So to summarize this in key takeaways, both sauna and hot tub, hot water immersion, have a high degree of efficacy. And I think you can get the highest consistent reliability when you have access to facilities that have those. It does come with some cost and added time, but it is probably the one that has the smallest risk of execution error, because most of these things are, there's a dial that sets the temperature. And so you know what the temperature is going to be. You've got a stopwatch and you can sit in it for a certain amount of time. And so I think clearly these are going to be ones that, like, in terms of can you guarantee that if you had access to it, can you do it? It is a much higher degree of likelihood that the answer to that is yes, barring it like literally breaking down. So we've gone through training in a hot environment. We've talked about adding additional clothes or a heat suit where you either are not in a hot environment or you are creating an artificially hot environment. And then finally, we went through sauna and hot water immersion protocols. Once we do those protocols, though, I think it's important to understand that just like any form of training, the benefit that you get degrades over time. So let's talk about how we can optimize these protocols, right? If we're going to spend the time doing them, let's know what it actually means to make use of them and keep them for the amount of time that you need in order to like get you to the race. So how do we optimally manage these protocols from both a maintenance and a safety perspective? So let's start from a maintenance perspective.
Okay. So to maintain the adaptation, you kind of need to understand the rate at which it decays. So some studies cite about 2 weeks if you don't do anything and you return to training normally in a cooler environment, that you will lose those adaptations. So another one that measured it at about 1 day of adaptation being lost for every 2 days without exposure. So slightly different rates, but somewhere in that ballpark of 2 to 3 weeks to lose what you gained in 2 weeks of adaptation. We do know that heart rate adaptations decay faster than the core temperature. And I didn't see anything specific about plasma volume, but given that that one comes in quickly, typically the ones that come faster also decay faster. So that, I'm guessing, is probably the first to go. But the good news is you can reacclimate and it comes back quickly. So this is sort of similar to speed work in the same way that you can kind of do a block and then you just need to like hit it continually with a dose of speed every couple of weeks, and you can pretty much maintain what you already built. So one study found that 2 days of reacclimation, so just going back and doing that same protocol, but just for 2 days in a row, will compensate for 12 days off. So if you think about it, if you kind of did your 2 week block early in the cycle, and then you just planned that 2 days of every 2 weeks following, you're then going to re-ping that adaptation, whether that's if it's hot outside, then you can just make sure that you're getting 2 workouts in outside. If it's sauna, you need to do 2 with sauna, or same with hot water immersion. But the interesting thing is it appears that every time you reacclimate, you may actually get a little bit more benefit. So again, similar to where we see overcompensation in training
It's like
more
a little
traditionally
boost.
with a workout, you're going to get, if you were at 100% and then you do your 2 days, maybe now you're at 102, 103. I'm making up numbers, but it does build over time. So there is, historically, the recommendations tended to be that heat training is something, especially with the passive versions, that you just kind of do during a taper. And I think now we're starting to see athletes implement it earlier and use it as part of their training strategically. So Matt, since you are doing it essentially during a taper. But I think there's other ways to attack it, and maybe we can talk about different strategies depending on when your race is and what adaptation you're really trying to capture for either training or racing.
Yeah. As we've shared, I'm tapering right now for the Vermont 100. And so I am currently doing a sauna protocol session. Today was, I think, the last day effectively. But I have implemented it in one of 2 to 3 general ways that I think you can implement these types of protocols. So one is, as you say, during the taper, where because it decays easily and relatively quickly, you want to have and do then this protocol as close to maybe like 3 days out from your race day, particularly if you are using the protocol for the purpose of any sort of performance enhancement, which of course I am trying to do in the context of a hot race. But even if you are trying to do that, as we mentioned earlier, because it just improves general fitness and things like VO2 max, then doing this up until a couple of days, if the purpose of it is to improve your race day performance, you want to do that probably up until 3 days in advance. Sometimes it's not possible if you're traveling for a race. And so that's something you need to consider if you're kind of banking on doing that and you forget that you're going to be traveling somewhere and you're going to be there 3 days in advance or 4 days in advance, or maybe even a week in advance, particularly if it's at altitude and you want to get there a week or 2 in advance. That may not be something you have access to. So that's just something to consider if you're going to implement it during the taper part of your cycle. The other main way I think that you can do this, particularly if you are doing it for the first time and you're not sure exactly how it will impact you, is to do it in the base phase of your cycle. So in the early part, and there it might be when you are using these protocols to aid in your ability to kind of kickstart training, and you're entering into a hot part of the season. And so this is a relatively easy way for you to sort of, kind of preheat the oven, as it were, in a sort of literal and metaphorical sense, to get yourself ready for a hotter cycle. So putting it in the very beginning part also allows you to test it. Make sure that you understand how the oh wow, that's purrs now going right into the microphone.
Did we get an ASMR bonus?
Yeah. Eliza, do you want to add something to this podcast episode?
He is
Um, so particularly if it's new to you and you're just trying to understand how the protocol will work, whether you even like training in the heat, because maybe that's something that you have not sort of intentionally tried to train in the hotter part of the day. Maybe it's something that really takes a lot out of you, and so the benefit does not outweigh the detriment to your training. That's the kind of thing that you want to do earlier in the training cycle in your base phase, than obviously finding that out for the first time during your taper. So that would be the second place to put it. The third place to put it would obviously be in the middle of the training cycle, or maybe a month or so out. And then, Molly, as you said, you do these sort of these re-upping parts where it's a little bit further out from the race. It's not during the taper, but it does allow you to get that performance benefit. And I think the sauna and hot water immersion is probably best when it's a month out, because it means that you're not disrupting what is a very key part of the training. You're not taking away from intensity that you might otherwise want to have in peak weeks that are 4 to 5 weeks out. So those are probably the 3 general spots. It really just depends on what you're doing and whether it might be the first time, and whether you're trying to figure out exactly how it works and how you will respond to it. So let's talk about how we do these things safely. Certainly, one of the most important pieces of any heat training protocol is how you hydrate. And crucially, and for different reasons, you need to hydrate both before and after. The before hydration is to ensure that you're doing it safely, that you're not putting yourself into a state of dehydration. That would be bad. And when I say dehydration, I mean like extreme dehydration, where you're then lightheaded and you're having detrimental effects, and it's beyond discomfort. It's into unsafe.
But I think
So
we want to make sure that we can actually get through enough of a dose. So
right,
even from before you're in any sort of distress, just making sure that you are starting a quality session in the same way that you would speed work or
right,
anything else, you are prepared for the work you're going to have to do.
right. The rehydration after is not only important to obviously make sure that you're rehydrating, but it is also critical in order to achieve the adaptations that are coming from the training, the heat training itself. If you don't rehydrate, then you are not giving your body the ability to have the plasma volume adaptations that the heat training is conferring on you. If you think about it similarly to if I were to train fasted and do a workout and then not eat afterwards for the next like 10 hours, we would all understand intuitively that that's bad, right? You need to feed your body. And we often hear about nutrition being critical in the 30 minutes after, a workout. It's a similar, I think, reason as to why rehydrating after a heat training protocol session is important as well, because your body then needs to rehydrate and respond to and start performing the adaptations that you're hoping to get from it.
And the increased plasma volume needs to come from somewhere. So you need to
Right.
be providing hydration to
To do that.
physically make that liquid.
Yeah. Of course, all of these should be done with care and caution. Have the fluid with you, as we were just talking about, for hydration, but also have sugar with you. Anybody who's worked hard in the gym has probably seen somebody have temporary vision loss. A lot of that is for a number of reasons, but can also be due to you're just incredibly low on sugar. And so I have also come out of I came out of a sauna session one day, and this is me having done this protocol now multiple times. Just one particular day, I definitely probably went into it not particularly fasted, but was in hindsight probably hadn't eaten as much, and so I was in there for a bit, and when I came out, it was after I stood up and walked to the shower that I really felt like I was going to faint, and that was not good. And so I've now, whenever I do a sauna session, I always have sugar in the locker with me, just in case. That's my way of being safe when I am doing that. Even though I am now more conscious about, in the previous hour or so, made sure that I've had something to eat and that I have hydrated, so that I am not putting myself at risk of not being able to handle the session. The next part of being safe here is something that may be less intuitive, which is that your body starts to become more reliant on sugar and your glycogen stores. And so, even though you might be running at a pace that you might think is an easy pace for you, as we've mentioned, not as much oxygenated blood is getting to your muscles, which means that your muscles are now relying more on your glycogen stores. That means that you need to be thinking more consciously about replacing them, even though that might be a shorter run, say 3 or 4 or 5 miles, where you're not normally having a huge amount of food before or after. But maybe this is something that when you're training in the heat, you need to be thinking about adjusting your fueling and fueling more regularly, particularly after even shorter runs. Certainly getting enough rest. If we don't rest and recover and allow our body to actually achieve these benefits, you're going to do all this work and you're going to spend this time, and then you're not going to get the benefit. Molly, is there anything else outside of what I've talked about that you think would be a part of how somebody does this safely?
The only other thing that comes to mind is if you happen to be anemic or tend in that direction, that will be exacerbated in heat typically. For myself, I didn't really realize I was anemic until one summer when I was just really wiped out, and then eventually realized that that was what was going on. But because of the adaptations that are happening and the fact that, as you said, you're already getting less oxygen and less red blood cells are going to your muscles. So if you're already low on iron, that's just going to make it that much more difficult. So I think it's something to be aware of if you feel like you're doing the heat training and it's really wiping you out to a degree that's beyond what's expected. That's something to check. And it might be something that you might want to monitor a little more closely, both in the summer and during a heat training protocol.
Yeah, so being informed, I think, is what we're trying to say. And if you're not approaching this with intention and you're just saying, great, there's ways that I can heat train, it is a higher stakes thing than just putting on the wrong shoe and running 10 miles and realizing that you get a blister. This is something that you need to think consciously about. It is absolutely a set of protocols that can be beneficial, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't consider really thoughtfully how you do it to do these things safely.
I think one thing to keep in mind is, and maybe this is actually less true of just running in the heat as an adaptation, but when you are working out in the heat, your body is going to naturally put the brakes on if you start to get too close to the line. You're either going to slow down, or you're going to have to stop, or you're going to register at least that you're overheating. Whereas sauna or hot water, you're not necessarily going to have the same brakes applied. And I think it is a little bit easier maybe to kind of tough it out, or to be inclined to tough it out if it starts to feel like it's too much. So I think it's just having a respect for the stress that you're implementing the same way that you would if it was pace miles or a more traditional form of what we think of as a workout stress.
Okay, Molly, this has been a lovely episode. If anybody has any questions, they should feel free to raise us. You can email us at coach@backline.com, or drop a comment on any of the socials where this is left. If you like this conversation and you think somebody might benefit from it, definitely give it a share. And we would appreciate subscribing and liking wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time.